A laugh broke across the room before most people even knew what had happened, sharp and sudden, the kind of laugh that does not come from joy, but from someone spotting a target. Then another one joined it. Then another. In less than 3 seconds, what had been a formal gala in a hotel overlooking Avenida Paulista started sounding like a school hallway after somebody stumbled in front of the wrong crowd. "Look at her," Beatrice said, lifting her glass and pointing straight at the piano. "She's just the janitor." A few people turned. A few smiled before they understood why. Then they saw Tatiane sitting at the bench, still in her light blue work uniform, white apron tied at the waist, yellow gloves on her hands, and that was enough for the room to make up its mind. Someone near the front laughed harder. Someone at the side leaned in and whispered to a friend. A man by the champagne table smirked and shook his head as if the night had suddenly given him free entertainment. Tatiane kept one hand lightly on the edge of the bench and adjusted her posture like she was trying not to take up more space than necessary. That small movement only made it worse. Cruel people love caution in other people. They mistake it for permission. "Who let her sit there?" Beatrice asked, louder now, enjoying the attention almost as much as the humiliation itself. "Seriously, who thought that was a good idea?" More laughter. Tatiane looked at the piano keys, not at the crowd. She knew that sound. Anyone who had worked long enough around rich people knew that sound. It was not surprise. It was dismissal. The kind that had nothing to do with what you had done and everything to do with what they thought you were. Renato heard the commotion and moved in fast. He was the event manager on duty, polished shoes, perfect suit, the kind of man who carried authority in his shoulders and assumed that was the same thing as character. He did not ask what was going on because he had already decided. He saw the uniform. He saw Tatiane at the piano. He saw the guests smiling. That was enough for him. "Miss," he said, not politely, just loudly enough for the nearest tables to hear, "this is a formal event. Get away from the piano right now." The room quieted only a little, the way people do when they think the main humiliation is about to begin. Tatiane looked up at him. Her face gave almost nothing away. Not anger, not panic, just a kind of stillness that did not fit the moment. "It's only 2 songs," she said softly. Renato gave a short laugh through his nose. "2 songs?" he repeated. "Do you think this is a joke? Go do your job." Another laugh rippled through the room. A woman pulled out her phone and tilted it toward Tatiane. A second woman beside her did the same, pretending she was only checking a message. Someone said, "She'll dirty the piano." Someone else answered, "No, wait, keep filming." A few people smiled with the lazy confidence of those who always expect the room to stay on their side. Tatiane heard all of it. She heard Beatrice laugh with her whole mouth open. She heard the clipped sound of heels turning on the floor as more guests angled themselves to watch. She heard one man say, "This is unbelievable," in that tone people use when they mean, "I'm glad it's happening to someone else." Still, she did not stand up. Patricia appeared then, tablet in hand, moving quickly but not calmly. Her face already carried the tension of someone trying to hold a problem together before it split in public. "Renato," she said under her breath, trying to keep the situation from becoming bigger than it already was, "give me 1 minute." Renato didn't even look at her at first. "Important for who?" he asked, keeping his eyes on Tatiane. "For us, it isn't." That line got the reaction he wanted. A few guests laughed again, relieved that the script of the moment still seemed clear. The worker had crossed a line, the man in charge would put her back in place, and everyone else would get to feel superior for free. Tatiane lowered her eyes for a second, then said again, "Just 2 songs." Her voice was not dramatic. She was not pleading. That was what made it land differently. If she had argued, the room would have enjoyed it. If she had cried, they would have called it a scene. But she did neither. She only repeated the same thing, quietly enough that anyone who wanted to misunderstand her still could. Renato stepped closer to the piano. "Did you not hear me?" he said. "This event is not for staff. Stand up." Beatrice took a slow sip from her glass, smiling over the rim. She liked this version of the night, the part where someone else got smaller in public, and she got to enjoy it with witnesses. "Honestly," she said, "how do people not know their place anymore?" I got a few nods. Not from everyone, but from enough. One man chuckled. Another woman shook her head with the practiced disapproval of someone who had built a whole personality on the idea of standards. Tatiana kept her hands in her lap. There was something about the way she sat there that began to irritate Renato more than open defiance would have. He was used to being obeyed quickly. He was used to people stepping back the moment he sharpened his voice. But Tatiana stayed. Not boldly, not theatrically. She simply stayed. And that made him feel challenged in front of people whose approval he liked too much to lose. "I'm not going to ask again," he said. "Move." Patricia stepped in a little closer now, still trying to stop a collapse that she could already feel coming. "Renato," she said, more firmly this time, "please." He cut her off with one raised hand, the kind of gesture that humiliated more quietly than words, but often hurt more. Then he pointed toward the exit with two fingers, not at the door, at Tatiana, like she was not part of the event, but something that had to be removed so the real evening could continue. A few guests leaned forward. Phone stayed up. One woman laughed into her shoulder, then looked around to make sure others had seen her do it. The room did what rooms like that often do. It turned one person into a stage and forgot, all at once, that she was a person at all. "It's only 2 songs," Tatiana said a third time. This time Beatrice laughed first. "2 songs for what?" she asked. "To prove what? That the cleaning staff has hidden talents?" Another guest, a man she had been speaking with earlier, laughed too hard at that, eager to match her cruelty. "Maybe she thinks this is open mic night." More laughter. The woman filming moved closer for a better angle. It was ugly how fast humiliation became content. That was the real thing happening in the room. Not a misunderstanding, not confusion, a performance of superiority, and everyone wanted evidence they had been there to witness it. Patricia saw the phones and went pale for half a second. "Put those away," she said, but not many listened. They were not watching Tatiana anymore. They were watching themselves watching her. Renato folded his arms. "Enough," he said. "Stand up now, or security will do it for you." That line made the room tighten, because threats changed the temperature. Beatrice's smile sharpened. She had not expected it to go that far, but she was not unhappy about it. Tatiana finally moved. Not to stand. She placed both gloved hands lightly on the piano. The sight of those yellow gloves against the polished keys made someone snort. "Oh my God," a woman whispered, half laughing. "She's really going to touch it." Renato stepped forward at once. "I said no." But Tatiana did not look at him. She looked at the keys the way someone looks at a door they have waited too long to open. Her breathing was steady. That was the detail that began, very quietly, to shift something in the room. Not because people respected her. Not yet. But because panic would have made more sense to them than calm. "Tatiana," Patricia said, and there was warning in her voice, but there was something else too, something Renato did not hear, because he only listened for threats to himself. It was not fear for the event. It was fear of what would happen if this room realized too late who it had chosen to mock. Renato heard nothing except the weakening echo of his own control, and he hated it. "Last chance," he said. "Get away from the piano." Tatiana spoke without raising her head. "You'll only need to listen for 2 songs." A few people scoffed. One of the men near the back muttered, "This is absurd." Another said, "Let her embarrass herself. It'll be over faster." Beatrice smiled at that. She thought the room still belonged to her kind of confidence, the kind built on being safe from correction. "Yes," she said, "go on. Let's all hear the janitor." That word landed hard because she wanted to. She wanted everyone reminded of the difference between themselves and Tatiana. She wanted the room arranged clearly again, top and bottom, invited and invisible, people who belonged and people who served. Renato glanced around and saw enough approving faces to feel restored. That was his mistake. He thought the room was still with him because cruelty always misreads applause as loyalty. Patricia looked at Tatiana one more time, and for a brief second Tatiana looked back. Something passed between them then, something small and silent. Not permission exactly, more like recognition. Tatiana was not confused. She knew what she was doing. That was when Patricia's grip tightened around the tablet. She looked toward the main table. where Donna Lucia had been speaking to guests under the large banner bearing the photograph of Augusto Moreira, founder of the institute that gave the night its purpose. Donna Lucia had not come forward yet. Maybe she had not fully seen. Maybe she had only heard fragments. Maybe she was about to. The room did not know it, but the next few seconds were about to divide the night into before and after. Renato leaned closer, lowering his voice in a way that somehow made it crueler. "Do you want to lose this job?" he asked. That would have made most people move. That was why he used it. Not because it was necessary, but because he knew fear worked well on people whose lives depended on staying employed. Tatiana did not answer. Beatrice laughed again, but there was impatience in it now. She wanted the payoff. She wanted the awkward stumble, the forced retreat, the walk back into invisibility. She wanted the moment she could turn back to her table and say something like, "Well, that was ridiculous," and be rewarded with agreement. But Tatiana was not giving her that ending. She sat there with her shoulders slightly tense, her back straight, her hands hovering over the keys, and in the middle of all that mockery, she looked less like someone stealing a moment and more like someone holding on to the only thing she had not let the world take from her. One of the women filming lowered her phone just a little, only because she wanted to see better. Another guest murmured, "What if she actually plays?" The man beside him replied, "Come on." Still, he did not sound sure. That tiny crack mattered. It was the first sign that certainty was leaving the room. Renato heard it too and rushed to crush it. "Enough of this," he snapped. "This is a gala, not a circus." Tatiana finally lifted her head and looked directly at him. She did not glare. She did not challenge him in any obvious way. She simply looked at him long enough to make his performance of authority feel exposed. Then she said, very quietly, "No, it's not a circus." Something in the room shifted again. Small, not enough to save her. Not yet, but enough that a few people stopped smiling. Beatrice rolled her eyes, annoyed that the moment was taking too long. "Can someone please remove her?" she asked, and this time the cruelty in her voice was plain enough that even a few neutral faces nearby stiffened. Patricia moved one step forward as if to intervene, but Tatiana placed her fingers on the keys before anyone could stop her. Renato reacted instantly. "I said don't." The first note cut through him. It was not loud. That was the first shock. It did not crash into the room, demanding attention. It entered quietly, as if it had every right to be there. A second note followed, then another, low and clean and steady. For a moment, the laughter tried to survive around it. A smile stayed frozen on Beatrice's face a second too long. One woman let out the last fragment of a laugh, and then stopped halfway through it. A man with a drink in hand turned his head. Another guest lowered his phone without meaning to. The room did not fall silent all at once. It lost confidence in pieces. That was what made it powerful. Tatiana kept playing, and suddenly the same people who had been ready to watch her fail had to confront something much worse for them. The possibility that they had just humiliated the one person in the room who had nothing to prove and something real to give. Renato stood beside the piano, jaw tense, still trying to decide whether stopping her now would restore his authority or destroy what was left of it. Beatrice's fingers tightened around her glass. Patricia closed her eyes for half a second, and from the main table, though almost no one noticed it yet, Donna Lucia had gone completely still. Tatiana did not look up after the first few notes. Her hands moved slowly, carefully, like someone opening a door that had been closed for years and did not want to break the hinges. The melody stayed soft at first, not weak, just patient, the kind of sound that did not ask the room for permission. It simply existed. Renato stood beside the piano with his mouth half open, still deciding whether to interrupt again. A few seconds earlier, that decision would have been easy. Now it wasn't, because the room was changing, and he could feel it even before he understood why. The laughter had stopped first. That answer irritated her more than it should have. She did not like not knowing. She especially did not like not understanding why the room had suddenly stopped behaving the way she expected. Not louder, just clearer, as if the piano itself had decided the audience deserved to hear every detail. A few waiters who had been moving through the crowd with trays slowed down and stopped near the walls. One of them shifted the tray onto a nearby table without looking away from the keys. Tatiana's shoulders stayed relaxed. Her back remained straight. She was not performing for applause. That much was obvious now. She played the way someone breathes when they are alone. Natural, steady, familiar. And that made it impossible for the room to pretend this was an accident. Renato felt a strange tightening in his chest. He hated the fact that the music sounded good. He hated the fact that people were listening. But more than anything, he hated the possibility that stopping her now would make him look foolish instead of powerful. He glanced toward Patricia. "Why is she still playing?" he whispered sharply. Patricia did not answer immediately. Her eyes were fixed on the piano. "Because," she said quietly, "people are listening." Renato scoffed. "This isn't a concert." But even as he said it, he lowered his voice again, instinctively respecting the silence that had settled over the room. The melody shifted into a slightly different pattern, one that carried a deeper emotion beneath it. Not sadness exactly. Something older than that. Something that sounded like a memory being carried carefully so it would not break. At the main table, Donna Lucia stopped breathing for a moment. The first few notes had caught her attention earlier, but she had been distracted by conversation and by the commotion in the room. Now that the hall had grown quiet, the melody reached her clearly. She turned her head toward the piano. Slowly, her eyes narrowed, just a little, as if she were trying to see through years instead of distance. Beatrice noticed the movement and leaned closer. "Donna Lucia?" she asked. There was no answer. Donna Lucia had gone completely still. Her hand rested against the edge of the table, fingers curled slightly, and her gaze stayed locked on Tatiana's hands moving across the keys. The melody continued. Renato folded his arms, impatient now. "This is turning into a spectacle," he muttered under his breath. But the word spectacle felt wrong. Spectacles are loud. This moment was quiet in a way that made people uncomfortable with their own earlier laughter. The man beside Beatrice leaned forward again. "I've heard this before," he said suddenly. "Where?" Beatrice asked. He shook his head slowly. "I don't remember, but it's familiar." Several other guests were having the same reaction. The melody carried a strange sense of recognition that spread through the room like a memory nobody could fully place. A woman near the back whispered to her friend, "Do you know this piece?" Her friend shook her head, but kept listening. Tatiana played through the transition smoothly, her hands moving with confidence now. The earlier hesitation had disappeared. Each note landed exactly where it belonged. Renato glanced around the room again. Too many faces were focused on the piano now. Too many expressions had changed from amusement to curiosity. That shift made him nervous. "All right," he said again, louder this time. "This is enough." But this time nobody laughed. Nobody even reacted. The silence after his voice was almost embarrassing. Tatiana continued playing. The melody reached a higher phrase now, one that stretched gently across the room and hung there for a second before resolving into a quieter line. At that exact moment, Donna Lucia inhaled sharply. It was a small sound, but it cut through the silence like a crack in glass. Beatrice turned immediately. "Are you okay?" she asked. Donna Lucia did not answer her. Her eyes had widened slightly, and the hand resting on the table moved slowly to her chest. The man sitting across from her noticed the change too. "Lucia," he asked carefully. She whispered something so softly that only the people closest to her heard it. "It can't be." Beatrice leaned closer. "What?" Donna Lucia's eyes stayed fixed on Tatiana. The melody continued, and now there was no doubt in her mind. She knew every rise and fall of those notes. She had heard them years ago, in another room, played by someone whose presence had shaped her entire life. Her voice trembled as she spoke again. "That's my father's music." The words were quiet, but the people near her table heard them clearly. One of them looked back toward the piano with sudden attention. "Your father?" Beatrice repeated. "Donna Lucia nuda slowly." "Yes." She swallowed once before continuing. "Augusto wrote that piece." The name traveled across the nearest tables like electricity. Augusto Moreira, the founder of the institute whose portrait hung on the banner at the front of the hall. The reason everyone had gathered there that evening. The man the Gala was honoring. The melody at the piano continued as if it had no idea it had just reopened a door in someone's memory. Renato heard the name and turned toward the main table. "What?" he asked sharply. Beatrice stood up halfway from her chair. "Renato," she said, her voice suddenly different. "That's Augusto Moreira's composition." Renato stared at her for a second. "That's impossible," he said automatically. "The maestro was supposed to play that later tonight." Patricia stepped closer, her face pale. "The maestro canceled," she said quietly, just before the event started. Renato blinked. "What do you mean canceled?" "He called an hour ago," Patricia answered. "Flight delay. He couldn't make it." Renato's expression hardened. "And you didn't tell me?" Patricia met his gaze calmly. "I was trying to find a solution." They both turned toward the piano at the same moment. Tatiane had reached the final section of the piece now. The melody slowed slightly, each note placed with deliberate care. The entire hall was listening. No one was laughing anymore. No one was filming. Even Beatrice's glass sat untouched on the table beside her. Donna Lucia stood up slowly from her chair. The people around her stepped back automatically, sensing that something important was unfolding even if they didn't fully understand it yet. Renato felt the room shift again. This time it moved completely beyond his control. Tatiane played the last few measures with steady hands. The final chord lingered in the air for a moment, soft but undeniable. Then the sound faded. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The silence was so deep that the faint hum of the city outside the windows seemed louder than it should have been. Tatiane lifted her hands from the keys and rested them quietly in her lap. Only then did she look up, and the first person she saw standing in front of her was Donna Lucia. Tatiane noticed the change in the room before anyone said a word. It wasn't loud. No one gasped or clapped. The change came in silence, a silence that felt heavier than before, like the entire hall had suddenly remembered it was supposed to be watching something important. She lifted her hands from the piano and slowly removed them from above the keys. For a second, she kept them hovering in the air, unsure whether she should stand up or simply leave before someone told her she had crossed another line. When she finally looked up, she saw a woman standing in front of her, Donna Lucia. The room parted around her without anyone being told to move. That was the kind of presence she carried. She wasn't loud, and she didn't rush, but when she walked somewhere, people naturally gave her space. Tatiane didn't know exactly who she was at first. She had seen her before, of course. Anyone who worked in the hotel had. But seeing someone from across a hall and suddenly finding them standing directly in front of you were two very different things. Donna Lucia stopped a few steps away from the piano. For a moment, she didn't speak. She just looked at Tatiane, not at the uniform, not at the gloves, at her. The room waited. Renato shifted uncomfortably beside the piano. He tried to recover his posture, straightening his jacket like he was preparing to retake control of the situation. "Donna Lucia," he said quickly, "I apologize for the interruption. We're handling it." But she didn't even turn her head toward him. Her eyes were still on Tatiane. "You played that piece," she said quietly. Tatiane nodded once. "Yes, ma'am." There was no pride in the answer, no attempt to impress anyone, just a simple acknowledgement. Donna Lucia took one more step closer. "Where did you learn it?" The question moved through the room like a ripple. People leaned slightly forward in their chairs. A few guests who had been whispering earlier now fell completely silent. Tatiane hesitated. "I didn't learn it," she said. Donna Lucia tilted her head slightly. "You didn't?" Tatiane shook her head. "I heard it." The answer confused several people immediately. A murmur spread through the crowd. "Heard it?" someone whispered. Renato frowned. "That doesn't make sense," he said under his breath. But Donna Lucia's expression changed. Not confusion, recognition. "Where?" she asked. Tatiane glanced briefly at the floor before answering. "Here." That single word made several people glance around the hall. Donna Lucia spoke again. "Here." Tatiane took a slow breath. "After events," she said, when the room was empty. A few of the staff members standing along the walls exchanged quick looks. Tatiane continued. Sometimes the musicians stayed late to practice. Sometimes they rehearsed for the next day. She paused. I was cleaning. The room became even quieter. I heard the piece many times, Tatiana said. I remembered it. Renato gave a short, dismissive laugh. You're saying you memorized an entire piano composition just by listening while cleaning tables? The tone in his voice was meant to sound amused, but it didn't land the way he expected. Several people were still watching Tatiana's hands. They had seen how steady those hands were on the keys. And suddenly Renato's skepticism sounded less convincing than he wanted it to. Tatiana didn't argue with him. She simply said, yes. The simplicity of the answer made the room shift again. Beatrice had been standing near her table the entire time, her glass forgotten beside her plate. She cleared her throat. That piece, she said slowly, looking toward Donna Lucia. Is it really your father's? Donna Lucia nudda. Yes. Her voice had grown softer now. My father wrote it many years ago. She turned slightly, glancing toward the large banner hanging near the stage. The portrait of Augusto Moreira looked down over the room with a calm expression. He used to play it in the evenings, she continued. At home, a few guests looked back at the portrait. Some of them had read about Augusto Moreira earlier that evening. The program booklets on the tables had mentioned him as a philanthropist, a founder, a visionary. But none of those descriptions had included the image of him sitting at a piano in his living room. Donna Lucia turned back to Tatiana. You played it exactly the way he used to. Tatiana blinked in surprise. I didn't know that, she said quietly. The honesty in her voice made several people shift in their seats. Renato folded his arms again. Even if that's true, he said, that doesn't change the fact that she interrupted the event. Patricia looked at him sharply. Renato. But he kept going. There are protocols, he insisted. Guests are not supposed to be disturbed by staff members playing instruments. The room reacted differently this time. No laughter, no agreement, just uncomfortable silence. Donna Lucia turned her head slowly toward Renato. Her expression was calm, but the calmness felt heavier than anger. You're concerned about protocols, she said. Renato nodded. Yes. She held his gaze for a moment. And what protocol, she asked, allows you to humiliate someone in front of an entire room? The question landed hard. Several guests immediately looked away. Beatrice stared at the floor. Renato opened his mouth, closed it again. For the first time that evening, he had no immediate answer. Tatiana shifted slightly on the bench. She had not expected the conversation to turn in her direction like this. Part of her wanted to stand up and quietly walk away before things became worse. I can leave, she said softly. The sentence made several heads lift at once. Donna Lucia turned back to her. No, the word was gentle but firm. You said there were 2 songs. Tatiana hesitated. Yes. Then play the second one. The room held its breath again. Beatrice looked up quickly. Really? She asked. Donna Lucia nudda. Yes. Renato exhaled sharply. This is becoming completely inappropriate. But no one was listening to him anymore. The attention in the hall had moved. Completely. Tatiana looked down at the piano again. Her fingers hovered above the keys. For the first time since she had sat down, her hands trembled slightly. Not from fear, from the weight of the moment. All around the room, people who had been laughing at her only minutes earlier were now waiting to hear what she would play next. Tatiana took one slow breath. Then she placed her hands back on the keys. The second song began, and this time, no one laughed at all. Tatiana let the first notes of the second song settle into the room before she allowed the melody to grow. It began softer than the first one, almost hesitant, as if the music itself were testing whether the room deserved to hear it. No one moved. The guests who had been laughing earlier now sat with their attention fixed on the piano, some leaning forward without realizing they had done it. The same people who had lifted their phones minutes earlier now held them lowered in their laps, unsure whether recording this moment would feel like witnessing something meaningful or exposing their own earlier cruelty. Renato stood a few steps away from the piano with his arms crossed, but even he had stopped speaking. Every time he considered interrupting again, the silence around him reminded him how badly that decision might land. The music carried a different emotion than the first piece. Where the earlier melody had felt like memory, this one sounded like reflection. Not sad, not triumphant, simply honest. Each phrase unfolded slowly, giving the room time to feel the shift happening inside it. Tatiana's shoulders relaxed again as she played, the small tremor that had touched her hands moments earlier fading with every measure. She no longer looked like someone asking permission. She looked like someone who had remembered where she belonged. Donna Lucia remained standing near the piano, listening without interruption. Her eyes moved between Tatiana's hands and the keys, and every so often a faint expression crossed her face, something between recognition and gratitude. The music seemed to bring back images that no one else in the room could see. A younger version of herself sitting across from a piano. Her father leaning forward slightly as he practiced a passage again and again until it sounded exactly the way he wanted. The quiet evenings when the house filled with music instead of conversation. She had not expected to feel any of that tonight. This gala had been planned as a celebration, a public tribute, a formal reminder of her father's legacy. But somehow the most personal part of that legacy had arrived through the least expected person in the room. Beatrice watched Tatiana carefully now, the earlier arrogance gone from her posture. The glass she had been holding earlier remained untouched on the table beside her. She had tried twice to pick it up again, but each time her hand had stopped halfway, as if the gesture suddenly felt inappropriate. Her mind replayed the moment when she had pointed at Tatiana and laughed. The words she had spoken sounded louder now in her memory than they had in the room. She shifted her weight uncomfortably. The man beside her leaned slightly closer. "She's really good," he whispered. This time Beatrice did not argue. She simply nodded once. The music continued, and the longer it played, the clearer it became that Tatiana was not repeating a simple melody she had memorized by accident. Her hands moved confidently across the keyboard, shaping the rhythm with subtle control. The phrasing changed with intention, rising slightly in one moment and settling again in the next. It was the kind of playing that revealed familiarity rather than luck. Several guests exchanged quiet glances. A woman near the center table murmured to her husband, "How could she know this piece so well?" He shook his head slowly. "She must have heard it many times." Near the back of the hall, two waiters stood beside the wall, their trays resting on a nearby table. One of them whispered, "She used to clean this room after rehearsals." The other nodded quietly. "I've seen her here late at night." Neither of them spoke again. The melody reached a gentle peak and held there for a moment before descending into a softer phrase. Tatiana's expression remained calm, almost distant, as if she had stepped somewhere else in her memory while she played. She was aware of the people around her, of course, but the music had become the center of her attention again, just as it had been on the nights she listened from the far side of the room while sweeping the floor or collecting empty glasses. Back then, the hall had been empty except for a few musicians finishing their rehearsals. The lights had been dimmer, the chairs stacked, the tables bare. She had paused in her work sometimes, just long enough to listen before returning to the tasks waiting for her. She never imagined that one day the same music would be heard with the entire room watching her instead. Renato shifted again, his discomfort becoming more visible as the room continued to ignore him. He had built his reputation on control, on the ability to manage every detail of an event so that nothing unexpected disrupted the evening. Now, the most important moment of the gala was unfolding without his direction. Worse, it was happening because of someone he had tried to remove. He glanced at Patricia. "This can't continue," he muttered quietly. Patricia did not take her eyes off the piano. "It already is," she replied. Renato's jaw tightened. He looked around the room again, searching for support, but the guests' attention remained fixed on the music. Even those who had agreed with him earlier now seemed unwilling to interrupt what was happening. That realization settled heavily on him. The melody moved into its final section. The pace slowed slightly, the notes spaced farther apart, each one lingering long enough for the room to absorb it. A quiet intensity filled the hall. It was no longer the uncertain silence of earlier, when people were unsure how to react. This silence carried respect. Donna Lucia stepped closer to the piano. She did not want to disturb the moment, but she wanted to see Tatiana's hands more clearly. The yellow gloves that had looked almost absurd earlier now seemed symbolic in a different way. They represented the work Tatiana had been doing while listening to this music night after night. Work that most of the people in the room had never noticed. As the final phrase approached, Donna Lucia felt something tighten in her chest. The piece was ending the same way her father had always played it, with a soft descending line that resolved into a final chord that lingered like the last breath of story. Tatiana allowed the final notes to fade slowly into the quiet air. Her hands remained on the keys for a second longer, feeling the vibration of the instrument disappear beneath her fingers. Then she lifted them. The silence that followed felt deeper than any applause could have been. No one rushed to speak. No one moved immediately. The entire room seemed to understand that breaking the quiet too quickly would somehow diminish the moment they had just shared. Tatiana slowly lowered her hands to her lap again. She looked up carefully, unsure how the room would respond now that the music had stopped. What she saw surprised her. The faces around the hall were different. The laughter had disappeared completely, replaced by expressions she had not expected. Curiosity, reflection, even admiration. Beatrice was the first guest to move. She stepped away from her table and approached the piano slowly, stopping a few feet away. Her voice, when she spoke, was softer than Tatiana had ever heard it. "That was beautiful," she said. The words sounded simple, but they carried a sincerity that had not been present earlier in the evening. Tatiana nodded politely, but did not respond. Donna Lucia turned toward the guests gathered around them. "My father used to say," she began quietly, "that music reveals the truth about a room. It shows you who is really listening." Several people lowered their eyes at that sentence. Renato remained silent. For once, he had nothing to say that would restore the authority he believed he had lost. Donna Lucia looked back at Tatiana. "Thank you," she said. "You brought something back tonight that I thought I might never hear again." Tatiana's lips pressed together slightly as she absorbed the gratitude in those words. "I'm glad," she said simply. Around them, the room slowly began to breathe again. Conversations resumed in low voices, but the tone had changed. The same people who had mocked Tatiana earlier now spoke carefully, aware that the evening had taken a direction none of them had expected. And for the first time since she had entered the room, Tatiana realized that the piano bench beneath her no longer felt like borrowed space. For several seconds after the music ended, no one spoke. The silence inside the hall felt different now. Earlier, it had been the kind of silence people fall into when they don't know what to do. This one carried weight. It asked everyone in the room to think about what they had just witnessed and about what they had done only minutes before. Tatiana remained seated at the piano bench, her hands resting quietly in her lap. She did not rush to stand up. She did not look around the room, searching for approval. She simply waited, unsure what came next. The first movement came from Beatrice. She stepped forward slowly, stopping a few feet from the piano. For someone who had spoken so confidently earlier, she now looked almost uncertain about where to place her hands. "Tatiana," she said. The name sounded different now. Earlier, she had said it like someone pointing out a problem. Now it sounded like someone trying to correct a mistake. She hesitated for a moment before finishing the sentence. "I owe you an apology." Several people nearby shifted in their chairs. Apologies were not common in rooms like this, especially public ones. Beatrice took a small breath. "What I said before," she continued, "was wrong. I shouldn't have spoken to you like that." Tatiana looked at her quietly. There was no anger on her face. No satisfaction either. Just calm. "It's all right," she said. But Beatrice shook her head. "No," she replied softly. "It isn't." The honesty in that answer made the room even quieter. Across the hall, a few of the guests who had laughed earlier now avoided looking directly at Tatiana. One of the women who had been filming slipped her phone back into her purse without saying anything. Renato remained where he stood, near the side of the piano. The expression on his face had hardened again, but not with the same confidence as before. Now it looked more like someone trying to hold onto authority that had already slipped away. Patricia stepped closer to him. "Renato," she said quietly. He glanced at her. "What?" Her voice stayed calm, but there was no hesitation in it. "I'll have to report what happened tonight." Renato stared at her. "For what?" he asked sharply. Patricia gestured subtly toward the room. "For the way you handled this situation." He let out a short laugh, though it sounded forced. "You're serious?" "Yes." The answer was immediate. "This will go to HR," she added. "It has to." A few guests nearby overheard the conversation and exchanged quick looks. Renato's face flushed slightly. "You're going to report me because of this," he said. Patricia met his gaze steadily. "No," she replied. "Because of what you showed about yourself." The sentence hung in the air for a moment. Renato looked around the room again, as if hoping someone would step in to support him. But no one did. Earlier in the evening, the crowd had been quick to laugh with him. Now those same people seemed suddenly busy with their drinks, their phones, or their conversations. The shift was quiet, but unmistakable. Across the room, Donna Lucia remained beside the piano. She turned to Tatiana again. "Thank you," she said once more. Tatiana nodded slightly. "I just remembered the music," she replied. Donna Lucia smiled faintly. "That's exactly why it mattered." She glanced toward the portrait of Augusto Moreira displayed above the stage. "My father believed that music didn't belong only to the people who performed it," she continued. "He believed it belonged to anyone who listened closely enough to understand it." Tatiana followed her gaze to the portrait. "I used to hear it after events," she said quietly. "When I was cleaning." Donna Lucia looked back at her. "And you never forgot?" Tatiana shook her head. "No." Beatrice spoke again from behind them. "Neither will we." The sentence carried more weight than she probably intended. Several guests nodded in quiet agreement. Not applause, not celebration, just acknowledgement. A few moments later, the woman who had been filming earlier stepped forward slightly. She held up her phone for a second. Then, without saying anything, she opened the video she had recorded at the beginning of the incident. The clip showed Beatrice laughing, Renato pointing toward the door, several guests smiling while Tatiana sat at the piano bench. The woman looked at the screen for a second longer. Then she pressed delete. The small gesture did not go unnoticed. Beatrice saw it. So did several others. It was the kind of moment that didn't need explanation. Donna Lucia turned to the guests gathered around them. "Tonight was meant to honor my father," she said. Her voice was calm, but it carried easily across the quiet room, and in a way none of us expected it did. She looked at Tatiana again, because the most important part of his work was never the institutions or the events. Her gaze moved slowly across the room. It was a reminder that people should be seen for who they are, not for the roles we assign them. A few guests lowered their heads slightly as she spoke, not out of embarrassment alone, out of recognition. The truth had landed where it needed to. Tatiana stood slowly from the piano bench. For a moment, she wasn't sure whether she should stay or quietly leave the room now that the music had ended. Donna Lucia noticed the hesitation. "You're not interrupting anything," she said gently. Tatiana smiled faintly. "I still have work to finish," she replied. The answer made several people in the room smile as well. Not because it was funny, because it felt honest. As Tatiana stepped away from the piano, the guests naturally made space for her to pass. No one laughed. No one pointed. For the first time that evening, she walked across the room without feeling invisible. Beatrice watched her go. Then she turned to the others at her table. "I think we all learned something tonight," she said quietly. No one argued with that. Near the doorway, Tatiana paused for a moment and looked back toward the piano. The instrument stood exactly where it had before, but the room around it felt different now. Not because of the music, because of what the music had revealed. High above the stage, the portrait of Augusto Moreira looked down at the room just as it had all evening. Yet somehow the expression in the painting seemed almost warmer. Perhaps because the lesson he had believed in had just played itself out in front of everyone. Some truths don't arrive through speeches. They arrive through moments. Moments when the people who laughed the loudest realized they were listening to the wrong things all along. And in that bright hall overlooking Avenida Paulista, the sentence that stayed with people long after the night ended was not the insult that had started it all. It was the quiet realization that followed. Uniforms do not define a person's worth. And sometimes the people we overlook are the ones who remind us what dignity actually sounds like.